Hello everyone, welcome to our Elective 7 session on legal research on the NextGen bar exam. My name is Professor Ashley Arrington, and I'm going to walk you through today what legal research will look like on the NextGen bar exam. I have been really trying to stay abreast of what's happening with NextGen, so I am quite informed and excited to tell you about it. Most recently, we just received information on this new piece of the NextGen bar that is called the Legal Research Performance Task. So previously we did not know what that was going to look like. Now we do. So we're going to walk through that today as well. So let's jump in. So where do things stand now with respect to adoption of the NextGen bar? So as of August 2025, you can see the states here that have announced their intention to adopt NextGen. So as of August 2025, there are only 10 states who have not yet announced their intention to do so. So this is evolving quite rapidly. We're very frequently seeing state after state after state announce their intention to adopt the NextGen bar. And there's a reason for that. So the NCBE right now provides the UBE materials to each state, right? So beginning in 2029, I want to say, don't quote me, but at some point after the NextGen bar exam has been administered, NCBE will no longer provide the information for the UBE. So that means that states would have to come up with their own bar exam, essentially, if they chose not to adopt NextGen. So that's what will likely happen. By the time you watch this video, there may be more states that have adopted NextGen as well. Now, I will also say that the timeline for when these states are adopting NextGen will vary. Some of them are starting as early as July 2026, which will be the first time that the exam is administered. Some of them are in 2027. Some of them are in July 2028. So, where does Texas stand? So just this March of 2025, Texas announced its intention to administer the NextGen bar beginning in July 2028. So that is this year's set of 1Ls, right? This is the first class that will sit for a brand new bar exam entitled the NextGen bar exam, right? It's going to look very different from the UBE. And so if you are a 1L watching this, this will be really important for you. If you're not a 1L, if you're a 2L or 3L, it's still important for you to know what's going on, right, in the legal profession. And also take note that the attorneys coming behind you, this year's set of 1Ls, will have been tested on this exam in a way that you weren't, right? So they may be coming in with an additional skill set, and you want to make sure that you're on par with them as well. So let's talk about what this new exam will look like. As I said, it's going to look very different from what we know now. So at present, there are a long list of doctrinal areas that are being tested on the UBE exam. That's going to change. And as you can see here, it will initially start with 8 doctrinal areas, right? Civ Pro, contracts, evidence, torts, BA, con law, criminal law, and real property. So it'll start out with 8 for those that are taking the July 2026 or 2027 exam. In 2028, which is when Texas will begin administering the NextGen bar, they will add family law. So if you're in Texas, just think 9 areas, right? You're going to be tested on these 9 doctrinal areas. Now, before, the doctrinal areas made up a huge percentage of the exam, right? As you can see here, NCBE has said that only 40 to 50% of the exam is going to be focused on those doctrinal areas, what they are calling foundational concepts and principles. So what is the rest going to look like? So the next large piece of the exam is going to be focused on practical lawyering skills that NCBE is referencing as foundational skills. So this again is going to be a major shift, and that's because they haven't really been tested. With respect to the UBE, there is a multi-state performance task that constitutes 20% of the exam, right? But now we're testing foundational skills in a host of new ways through a host of new question types that we'll talk about, multiple types of performance tasks. We'll talk about that as well. But you can see the skills areas listed here, right? So now, not only are those 9 doctrinal areas being tested, now you've got legal research, you've got legal writing, you've got issue spotting and analysis, investigation and evaluation, right? Client counseling and advising, negotiation and dispute resolution, and then finally client relationship and management, right? So you've got 7 areas listed there, and those areas are going to constitute somewhere between 50 to 60% of the exam. So that's huge, right? Again, the exam that the 1Ls are taking is going to look much different. Now, I've bolded legal research here. Obviously, that's our focus today. But there's another reason why I've bolded it. So let's talk about that. Of those skills areas, legal research is going to be the most heavily tested skills area. So legal research is going to be hugely important on the NextGen bar exam. Okay? And the way that we know that is through a few ways, right? So we'll talk about this. Legal research is tested as both skills and knowledge. So they are going to test legal research skills, but they're going to also test your knowledge of legal research sources, of legal research methods, right? So you're seeing legal research tested in multiple ways. You're also seeing it tested through multiple question types, right? So we're going to see legal research questions that are multiple choice questions. That's something brand new. That's something we haven't seen before. We also have these new integrated question sets that are also going to include legal research focused questions. Okay, so we'll look at each of those question formats. And then, as I said, in past with the UBE, we had the UBE included a multi-state performance task. Okay, so we're still going to have something. We're going to have a separate performance task that looks very much like that. We're also going to have a brand new performance task that is entitled the Legal Research Performance Task. So that's obviously specific to legal research, and that's going to be a huge piece of the exam as well. So let's talk about some of sort of why that's happening, what that looks like, and we'll also speak to preparation and how kind of what we're doing at Texas Tech will prepare you to be effective on the NextGen bar. So first, how is it that research is being tested as both skills and knowledge? Okay, so we've got our skills. We're going to look at that in just a minute in terms of what they're looking at when they ask you to show effective legal research skills. But you can see here that it's also listed as a knowledge area, right? So it's listed as a knowledge area wherein skills are applied. Okay, so with respect to that piece, knowledge, I kind of mentioned this already, right? They're testing sources, and then they're testing methods, your methodology. What's your process of going through the legal research process, right? So the other area is dispute resolution. That will also be tested as a skills area like we saw, but then additionally as a knowledge area wherein skills are applied. Okay, so it's just 2 of those skills areas that are also tested as knowledge areas. Right, so that is one piece of why legal research is significant in terms of the weight that it is allotted on the NextGen bar. What do those skills look like, right? So NextGen, when they started putting together the NextGen bar, they conducted a practice analysis. This was in 2019. This was conducted amongst practicing attorneys and asking, what are the things that you're seeing that you need new attorneys to be able to do, right? What are the most commonly performed tasks? And you can see them on the list listed at left here. And so that's what the NextGen bar has sort of been built around, is ensuring that new attorneys can effectively do these things. And if you look through that list, I've highlighted them for you here, but there are 4 areas that are specific to legal research. Right, that first piece is identifying issues in a client matter, including legal, factual, or evidentiary issues. Okay, that's our issue analysis that we've talked about. Researching case law is also listed, right? Next is researching statutory and constitutional authority. In the sample questions that have been released thus far, I will note that we've seen examples for statutory research questions, not yet constitutional research questions, but that is something that may come, right? And then finally, we see research secondary authorities. So as you know, during our LP workshops, we worked from a 4-step process, right? We worked from our step 1, which is our issue analysis, right? Where we're orienting ourselves to the problem. We're going through the who, what, when, where, why, right? Who's involved? What's happening? What do I know about this area of law? What do I need to know to answer the question? What are their specific legal issues, right? Step 2 was secondary sources, right? Looking to secondary sources in order to point us to primary law, right? The actual law, actual codified law or case law. So we want to look to secondary sources before we go to step 3, right? Because step 2 will point us to step 3, codified law, right? So we're looking for relevant statutes. We're looking for relevant regulations, right? We want to find those things before we move to step 4, right? Where we look to case law that has helped to interpret codified law, right? So how is that statute applied? How is that regulation applied, right? But if you look at this 4-step process that you're familiar with from the LP research workshops, and then you look to the left, you see that language that we just looked at on the previous slide with those most commonly performed tasks, right? So identifying issues in a client matter, again, as we said, that's your issue analysis. Research secondary authorities, that's our second workshop on secondary sources. Same with statutory authority. Our step 3 codified law session in the fall of your 1L year was focused on statutory authority, right? And then we built on that in the spring. But that is directly in line with what NextGen plans to test, right? And then same thing with case law. That's our step 4, workshop 4. And so using this 4-step process is going to help prepare you for the NextGen bar. And if you're not taking the NextGen bar, you're still taking the UBE, it still puts you in a position where you have developed those same skills that the new attorneys behind you have developed in order to prepare for the NextGen bar exam. So next, I want to look at some of these actual questions. I want y'all to just have an awareness and understanding of what some of these questions will look like. And we're going to start with some multiple choice examples. Before we go into that, however, I want to point out the types of language that you're going to be seeing when you see these multiple choice questions that are testing legal research. So, these sample questions that have been released, there are several of them, but only 4 of them touch legal research, at least that have been released thus far. And so in looking through those questions that test legal research, we see some specific language, right? With 3 of those questions, the language starts with, which of the following legal topics are most important to research? And then some of those questions end with, before advising the client. Others end with, to determine the likelihood of success on a specified motion. So you can expect to see these types of language in the multiple choice questions. This language, from what we have thus far, has provided 6 answer choices, and then 2 of those choices are correct answer choices. So that is a little bit more difficult than having 4 answer choices with only 1 correct answer choice, right? However, if you do get 1 correct answer and not both correct answers, you still will receive some credit for getting 1 of the 2 correct answers. The next language that we see is this, which of the following search terms would produce relevant resources? And then obviously the ellipses is specific to your question, right? So with this particular example, we see 4 answer choices with 1 correct answer choice. So let's see what that looks like. But again, takeaway here, or one important takeaway here, is you'll see multiple choice questions that have both 6 answer choices and 4 answer choices with 2 correct answers and 1 correct answer respectively. So be prepared to see both of those question layouts. Okay, so with respect to the 4-1, right, we looked at this language already. Which of the following search terms would be most likely to produce resources that will answer the client's question? And then you can see the answer choices, their concepts, right? So you do need to have an understanding of these concepts, and you will, right? You'll have studied contracts in preparation for the NextGen bar. But you're also issue spotting here, right? So we're saying which of the following search terms would be most likely to produce resources. Well, in order to know those terms, you've needed to identify what the area of law is and what the relevant issues of law are, right? So here you've determined, with this particular question, A, right, accord and satisfaction. I won't read the question aloud to you, but you've identified that this is the legal issue. And so, of course, in practice, you would take that and you would enter it as a search term, right? That would be one of your initial steps in conducting research. So here's an example of the 6-2. Okay, so we've got a question here. In our last question, we saw search terms as sort of a keyword to alert us to the fact that we're looking at a research question. Here we see the word research explicitly mentioned, right? And we see that language we looked to already. Which of the following legal topics are most important for you to research to determine the likelihood of success on a motion to suppress? Okay, and then again, this is issue spotting as well, right? So you are determining what area of law and what particular issues of law are at issue, and then you're going to take that and use it to conduct legal research, right? So you see this language as well. The next question is, again, something we've seen already. It starts with the same language as what we just looked at in the previous slide. Which of the following topics are most important for you to research, right? We see that keyword. And then this particular call ends with before advising the client, and then select 2 of the 6, right? And so you're doing the same thing. You're reading the hypo here, you're identifying what the issues are, you're identifying what you need to research, okay? And so again, much of the research testing is tied to this issue spotting. So let's look now to some integrated question set examples. So I'm going to open by doing the same thing where we look to some of these questions and the language that is used for these questions. So we've got 3 examples from the sample questions that have been published thus far that specifically touch legal research. The language looks, and we'll see this when we look to the questions, right? Advise on specific legal sources, most likely to, right, be helpful for your research. They'll see the language that follows that call vary. The next type of language we'll see, which of the following facts most support a particular cause of action. And then finally, list 2 claims to bring on behalf of a client. So you can see here, this first question is really testing knowledge of sources. It's asking you for specific legal sources, right? So that's separate from skills. Again, we talked about how research will be tested as both skills and knowledge, and here's an example of where you're seeing it tested as knowledge. And then the next 2 pieces, right, are testing legal research as a skill, right? And we'll talk about that analytical piece, just like we saw with multiple choice, testing issue analysis or issue spotting. Now we're seeing research being tested as analysis in the integrated question sets as well. Okay, so integrated question 2. Advise the law clerk on 2 specific legal sources that are most likely to provide a controlling definition of a specific term, habitable in this example, that's tied to our hypothetical here. So what are they wanting here? Let's look to some of the representative correct answers. So they're wanting examinees to list 2 of these, right? You could list statutory law, right, with a definition section that is speaking to habitable in this instance. You could list a high court decision, right? You could list an appellate court decision, right? So case law is going to be relevant as well. We also see regulatory or administrative law, where those laws speak to a definition for habitable, right? There's a common thread here, okay? What is the common thread? We're seeing primary law, right? We're seeing both codified law and case law listed. We're seeing primary law. We're not seeing secondary authorities, right? So in terms of what NCBE has released thus far for these types of questions where they're asking about sources, they want to hear about primary sources and not secondary sources. Next question, right? So it's the hypothetical starts with telling us, after discussing your research, you attempt to negotiate a settlement, right? So you know where you're at with respect to the issue. You've spotted the issue, okay? You know what your next steps are. And so you want to know what facts are going to provide the most support for your cause of action, which happens in this instance to fall under statutory section 625D. Okay, so now you're looking through these facts and you're identifying the relevant facts that are important for this cause of action. And so again, you're thinking about analysis, right? You're not thinking about like how to get into a database so much as you're thinking about the research analysis and the analysis skills that will be important to your research process. And then the same thing here too, right? The language varies a bit. Your legal research since the interview supports the finding, right? And then your factual investigation has established 2 additional things. And so having completed your research, you have your legal claim, you have your factual information, and you want to identify the claims that can be brought on behalf of your client. Okay, so you're looking at these specific facts in order to determine whether they will make sense for the claim, right? And that again is more of an analytical task. So we're continually seeing research analysis tested throughout these questions. As I mentioned previously, we will also see a brand new portion of the bar exam that is entitled the Legal Research Performance Task. So to be clear, we will still have the traditional performance task that looks much like the MPT that we see on the UBE right now. This is going to be yet a separate, another performance task that again is specific to legal research. It's going to look a little bit different, and we'll talk about that. But in the same way as your traditional research or your traditional performance task, you'll be provided a file, and that will have various pieces of your hypothetical client's information. So that could be interview transcripts, it could be transcripts from a deposition, it could be an email from your client, it could be all types of client information, right? And then you'll have your library, which are your legal sources, and these are going to be just like this current exam. These are going to be from your hypothetical jurisdiction, state of Franklin, and they're going to give you cases, statutes, rules, etc. from the state of Franklin, right? So that's the law that you're working with. So you've got your file and your library, okay? You're going to answer some questions that are in a different format from what you see now in the MPT. Okay, so we'll see multiple choice questions, which we haven't seen in the MPT. We'll look at those in just a moment. But like the MPT, you will be asked to complete a specific task. So they may say draft a memo, draft a email to a client. That's the example we'll look at today, right? You won't know going into the performance task what specific task you're being asked to accomplish. But again, you've now got two types of performance tasks that you'll be asked to complete on the NextGen bar. So for the multiple choice portion of that legal research performance task, what do those questions look like? So here's an example, right? Which of the following statements are true regarding the Franklin Truth in Lending Act, right? So we have a statutory act here, and then the examiners are asking you to determine two true statements, right? So understanding authority is going to be important, right? This is a statutory act, right? So we know it's primary authority and not secondary authority, right? And then it's asking you, you're obviously going to read through the Lending Act, right? And determine where it falls with respect to authority. So it ranks lower than the Restatement Third of Agency, right? This is a statutory act, whereas a restatement is secondary authority, right? So in terms of authority, it's going to rank higher than the restatement, right? Contains a common law rule statement. Well, we're looking at a statutory act here and not case law, right, where we would find a common law rule statement. Contains ambiguity or an undefined term that requires the use of additional resources. You're going to have to look to see whether that's true or not, right? We can't tell that just from looking at the question here. But again, you can see here that you need to have an understanding of authority, both primary versus secondary, and then you need to have an understanding of the hierarchy of authority, right? So that's one example. The next example is which of the following statements are true regarding a specific case. Again, the hypothetical case from the jurisdiction of Franklin, right? And we're in a court of appeals here. So in order of authority, it ranks higher than departure lending. You can see that departure lending is a Supreme Court case. So we know that's not true, right? An appellate court case is not going to rank higher than a Supreme Court case. Common law rule statement. Generally, that's the case with case law, right? So we want to determine that we do find a common law rule statement. Distinguishes this other case. You've got to look at the materials to determine is it distinguished from Farmers Bank, right? You're going to be provided the Farmers Bank v. Wood case, and you're going to determine whether it looks different. Is there an important distinction between the two? Is it mandatory or persuasive authority for Jane? So again, we're in the jurisdiction of Franklin, but is Jane in the jurisdiction of Franklin? The answer to that is going to be yes, right? But is this going to be mandatory or persuasive? Like, were we in a trial court before this, right? Overrules departure lending. Well, we can see that departure lending was a Supreme Court decision, so we know it won't overrule that decision. But again, you see here an understanding of sources, right? Where would I find a rule statement? I'm going to find that within the case law. What about authority? Is this mandatory? Is this persuasive? And so you have to have an understanding of those concepts in order to correctly answer these types of questions. Question 3. Which of the following statements accurately represents the court's decision? Select one response. Okay, so now you're just reading the case and you are determining what the holding is, right? What's the important takeaway from that case? Legal research question 4, right? You're reviewing the case again, and then you're listing two facts that are distinguishable from the facts that were dispositive in the Edito Holdings case, okay? So you looked at these two cases. First, you're determining what facts were dispositive in that Edito Holdings case, and then you're finding two facts from Jane's case that are distinguishable from those dispositive facts, right? How will our case turn given that our facts differ from those important facts in the Edito Holdings case? So, in this example and the last example where you are determining the holding, again, we're not thinking about getting into a legal research database. We're thinking about legal research analysis. And so those analytical skills are what are truly being tested. Legal research question 5. Which of the following research questions is your library of 4 sources most in need of supplemental research? Select one response option. Okay, so you've read through the materials and you have determined what question still needs to be answered, right? And so that, again, is analysis. That's determining the relevant research question. And then we also have our writing assignment that is part of the legal research performance task. And it tells us, in your research, you were unable to find any additional sources related to Jane's question. Using the sources in your library, write an email to your supervising attorney. In your email, thoroughly analyze whether Kathy had apparent authority to use Jane's credit card to pay for the $400 brake replacement. Analyze only this issue. Okay, so I've highlighted analyze here because this is yet again another example of the fact that these research questions are focused on research analysis. Okay, so focused on analytical skills. That's the skills piece. If you want to know more about the NextGen bar exam, there's a link here for you to follow. This is just the general NextGen bar exam informational page, okay? From there, you can get to all types of information related to the NextGen bar. You can also sign up for NextGen updates, right? If you want to get emails and be apprised of what's happening when other states are signing on, new questions are being released, various types of information that are being announced by NCBE. And then you see the sample questions and answers. And so we looked at some of those today, right? We looked at multiple choice. We looked at integrated questions. We looked at the questions within the legal research performance task. You can follow this link to view all of those sample questions. They are separated, so you'll have to click into multiple choice, click into integrated, click into legal research performance task, but all of those are there for you if you're interested in looking at the representative correct answers for some of the questions we went through today, and looking at some other questions that may or may not be tied to legal research. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in kind of giving you an overview of what you can expect to see on the NextGen bar exam with respect to legal research. We're still learning, right? We'll continue to gain more information as to what this will look like, but now we have a lot more now that we are have seen some of those legal research performance task questions. So please reach out with your questions. I'm happy to chat. Like I said, I've been trying to stay abreast of all of these things and sort of be leading the charge for research instructors in terms of what we'll see on NextGen and how we can prepare for NextGen. And if you're 1L, you've also already seen some of these NextGen questions in your workshops, right? So we're introducing these questions, both multiple choice and integrated, into each of the workshops. You'll see them in the in-class exercises. You'll continue to see them in the final assessments, okay? So this is just an effort for us to make sure that y'all are prepared for what you're going to see on the NextGen bar, but equally prepared to have the critical research and analytical skills to be successful in practice. Okay, so I will shut up now. Once again, reach out if you have questions. Thanks so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.